Always been a night owl, so when the opportunity came up to work the graveyard shift at a gas station off Highway 19, I took it without hesitation. It seemed easy enough. Sit behind the counter, ring up the few customers who dared to stop by in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. and kill time until the sun came up. Pay wasn't great, but I didn't mind. The solitude suited me, or at least that's what I thought. The station itself was ancient, practically falling apart at the seams. Flickering neon sign outside barely held on to its last breath, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked asphalt. The lights inside weren't much better, buzzing and occasionally dimming as if they were on their last legs. The worst part, though, was the silence. During the day, you could hear the occasional car passing by, but at night, silence was absolute. It was so thick you could almost feel it pressing against your eardrums. It didn't take long for the unease to set in. It wasn't fear, not yet, anyway, but a low, creeping sensation that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way the shadows in the corners of the store seemed to stretch just a little too far. Maybe it was the way the trees lining the highway swayed, even when there wasn't a breath of wind. Whatever it was, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My first real taste of something wrong came about a week into the job. It was around 2 a.m. and I was half asleep behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine someone had left behind, when I heard it. The low hum of an engine outside. Perked up, expecting a customer, but when I looked through the dirty glass door, froze. There was a car parked by Pump 3. Its headlights were on, illuminating the front of the station in a harsh, white light. But there was no one in the driver's seat. The car just sat there, engine idling, the driver's door wide open, like someone had stepped out in a hurry and never came back. I waited, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows, but no one did. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last, and still no one appeared. My heart started to pound in my chest, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. This was the kind of thing you heard about in ghost stories, the kind of thing that never actually happened. Gathering what little courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and stepped outside. The air was freezing, way too cold for a summer night, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me as I approached the car. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see. When I finally reached the car, I leaned in and looked through the open door. The interior was empty. No bags, no signs of life, nothing. Just an empty, idling car with no driver in sight. I stepped back, my pulse racing, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The security cameras. I glanced up at the camera mounted on the corner of the station, the little red light blinking steadily. If anyone had been here, the cameras would have caught it. I hurried back inside, my fingers trembling as I rewound the footage, my eyes glued to the screen. But there was nothing. No car pulling in, no headlights, no door swinging open, just the empty parking lot, still and silent. It was like the car had appeared out of thin air. Couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I wanted to believe it was just a glitch, that I was overtired and seeing things. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place. Something that had been wrong long before I showed up, and somehow I knew this was only the beginning. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overreacting to what had to be a simple glitch in the system. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself. The next few nights at the station were quiet. Too quiet. Each hour dragged on, heavy with the kind of silence that made your thoughts louder, your heartbeat harder to ignore. It started small, almost subtle. A shift in the air, flicker of movement just out of the corner of my eye. I'd be ringing up some late-night trucker or restocking shelves, and suddenly I'd feel it. A presence, lingering just beyond my line of sight. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The feeling never left. One night, I was cleaning the coffee pots when I saw it, my first real glimpse of whatever had been lurking in the shadows. I was wiping down the counter when a flash of movement caught my attention. I looked up, expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a customer wandering outside, but instead I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the station's lights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, like a shadow stretched too far. It stood perfectly still, just at the edge of the darkness where the light from the station couldn't quite reach. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest, and when I looked again, it was gone. I rushed outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the parking lot and the surrounding woods. But there was nothing, just the empty highway and the sound of my own breathing. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Couldn't have. But as much as I searched, there was no sign of anyone or anything. When I went back inside, I checked the cameras again, hoping to catch a glimpse of what I'd seen. But just like with the car, there was nothing on the footage. The parking lot was empty, the station still and silent. It was like the figure had never existed, like it had been erased from reality the moment I looked away. That was the night the noises started. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable over the hum of the fluorescent lights. A soft scratching sound, like something was scraping against the walls of the station. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe a raccoon rummaging around outside. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder, more insistent. Scratching turned into tapping, like someone, or something, was trying to get in. I forced myself to stay behind the counter, gripping the edge of it so hard my knuckles turned white. Every instinct told me to go outside, to confront whatever was out there. But another, stronger part of me, the part that had been terrified since the night the car appeared, kept me rooted in place. It was close to 4 a.m. when the tapping finally stopped. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and leaned back, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I heard it. My name. Someone was whispering my name. Peter. Voice was soft, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the far corner of the store, near the stockroom. My skin prickled with fear, but I forced myself to move, follow the sound. Closer I got to the stockroom, the colder the air became until I could see my breath misting in front of me. The door to the stockroom was ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness beyond. Peter. The voice called again, clearer this time, as if whoever or whatever was standing right inside. I swallowed hard, reaching out with a trembling hand to push the door open. The hinges creaked, the sound echoing in the stillness as I stepped inside. The stockroom was empty. Shelves of supplies lined the walls, untouched. But the voice, it was so close. I turned in a slow circle, scanning every inch of the room, but there was no one there, just shadows. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Written on the wall, in long, jagged scratches, were the words, "I see you." After that night, sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words. "I see you," etched into the back of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was some sick prank, maybe some local kids messing with the new guy. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that wasn't human. The following nights were a blur of sleepless hours and creeping dread. The shadows in the station seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were alive, pulsing with a sinister energy. Every night, I heard the voice again, calling my name, taunting me, daring me to confront it. And every night, I ignored it, too terrified to find out what lay beyond the darkness. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. The whispers turned into laughter, low and mocking, echoing through the empty aisles. The temperature in the station dropped so low that the windows began to frost over, despite the summer heat outside. I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in the frigid air as the shadows seemed to close in, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. One night, the laughter was louder than usual, filling the station with a sound that was both human and something else entirely. I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were shot, my mind teetering on the edge of sanity. I had to do something, anything, to make it stop. I grabbed the flashlight and headed toward the back of the store where the stockroom was. The door stood ajar, just like before, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. The laughter stopped as I approached, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I stood at the threshold, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Part of me screamed to turn back, to leave the station and never return. But another part, the part that needed answers, that needed to know what was happening, forced me to push the door open. The stockroom was pitch black, a single overhead light flickering weakly before going out entirely. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The shelves loomed like shadows in the darkness, casting long, twisted shapes on the walls. And then I saw it. Something moved at the far end of the room, just out of the flashlight's reach. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking with fear. The only response was a soft shuffling sound, like something dragging across the floor. I took a step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to steady my breathing. The beam of light caught something. Figure, hunched over, its back turned to me. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that were too long, too thin, like they were stretched beyond what was possible. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the thing's head was bowed low, as if it was looking at something on the floor. "Peter." The voice was low, raspy, and it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from all around me, echoing off the walls, bouncing inside my skull. Figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. But I knew, whatever this thing was, it was the source of the whispers, the laughter, torment I'd been enduring. My heart raced as I took another step closer, compelled by some force I couldn't understand. The figure remained still, its head still bowed, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul even though it wasn't looking directly at me. "Peter?" The voice repeated, louder this time, more insistent. I was close enough now to see that the thing wasn't alone. Something was on the floor in front of it, something dark and glistening. I shined the flashlight down, and my stomach twisted in horror. It was me, or at least it looked like me. A distorted, twisted version of myself, lying lifeless on the cold, concrete floor. The eyes were wide open, staring up at nothing, and the mouth was twisted into a silent scream. Blood pooled around the body, seeping into the cracks of the floor, and I could see the reflection of the figure in it, hovering over the corpse like a dark shadow. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat as the realization hit me. This was a warning, a vision of what was to come if I stayed. Figure began to turn, slow and deliberate, and I knew that if I saw its face, if I locked eyes with whatever it was, it would be the end of me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, crashing through the door and out into the main store. The laughter followed me, louder now, echoing in my ears as I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get out, to leave this cursed place behind. The lights flickered and died as I threw myself through the front door, cold night air hitting me like a wall as I sprinted to my car. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The feeling of something chasing me, of something reaching out to grab me, was too strong. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and sped off down the highway, station disappearing in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. But even as I drove away, I knew I wasn't safe. The whispers followed me, seeping into my mind, my soul. I could still hear the voice, soft and menacing, promising that this wasn't over. Promising that it would find me, no matter where I went. And deep down, I knew it was telling the truth. I wish I could say that I never went back, that I left that gas station behind and never looked over my shoulder again. But the truth is, can't run from something like. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed place, it was always there, lurking just beyond the edges of my sanity. The whispers, the laughter, the visions, they followed me, haunting every waking moment and every restless night. I tried to get help. I went to the police, but they found nothing at the gas station. No body, no figure, no scratches on the walls, nothing but an empty, quiet building. They looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was. I saw a doctor, tried to explain the nightmares, the voices, but all they did was prescribe pills that dulled the edges of my fear without erasing it. Nothing worked. Nothing could keep it at bay. Days turned into weeks, and still, the darkness clung to me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, consumed by the fear that whatever was out there would find me. And it did. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't tell if they were in my head or echoing through the empty rooms of my apartment. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to go back. And finally, I did. I don't know what possessed me to return to the gas station that night. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was madness, but I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape it. The only way to end this nightmare was to face it, confront whatever was haunting me, and end it once and for all. Or die trying. The drive back was a blur, the road stretching endlessly before me as I sped through the darkness. The station appeared on the horizon like a malignant growth, its sickly green sign flickering weakly as if it had been waiting for me. I parked the car and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This was it. The end, one way or another. The air was unnaturally still. I stepped out of the car, my breath misting in front of me despite the warm night. The station loomed in front of me, more sinister than ever, its windows dark and empty. I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on me, whispering, beckoning me inside. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and walked into the darkness. The interior was just as I remembered. Bold, silent, and suffocating. The lights flickered weakly as I made my way to the back of the store, where the stockroom door stood ajar, just as I had left it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as I approached, the air thick with a sense of dread so powerful I could taste it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, flashlight in my hand casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The stockroom was just as dark and empty as before, the shelves looming like sentinels in the gloom. But this time, I wasn't alone. The figure was there, waiting for me, standing at the far end of the room. It was taller now, more defined, its limbs long and twisted, head cocked at an unnatural angle. The skin was still pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and as I stepped closer, I could see that it was no longer facing away from me. It was staring straight at me. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs as the figure slowly began to move toward me. Its steps were slow, deliberate, its limbs bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. The closer it got, bolder the air became, until I could barely breathe, my lungs burning with the effort. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. "Peter?" The voice was soft, but it echoed in my skull, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command, a summons I couldn't resist. The figure reached out, its long, thin fingers stretching toward me, and as they brushed against my skin, I felt a cold so intense it burned. I don't know what happened next. One moment I was standing there, staring into the abyss, and the next, I was on the floor, the flashlight rolling out of my hand as I scrambled back, trying to put distance between myself and the thing that had come for me. But the room was shrinking, the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing everything. The figure loomed over me, its face inches from mine, and for the first time, I saw its eyes. They were empty, hollow voids, blacker than the darkest night. And as I stared into them, I felt my mind unraveling, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The whispers were everywhere now, a cacophony of voices all chanting my name, all urging me to give in, to let go. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. With a surge of adrenaline, I lashed out, my hand connecting with something solid, something cold. The figure recoiled, its eyes narrowing, and for a split second, the whispers faltered. I took my chance, scrambling to my feet and stumbling toward the door. Air was thick with cold, heavy with the scent of decay, but I forced myself to move, to escape. I don't remember how I got out of that room, how I made it back to the front of the store. All I know is that when I burst through the door and into the night, I was gasping for air, my skin slick with sweat and cold. The station was silent, darkness complete, but I could still feel it. Watching, waiting. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the highway, the gas station fading into the distance. The whispers had stopped, the laughter gone, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel the cold, emptiness gnawing at the edges of my mind. I never went back to that gas station. I left town the next day, drove until I ran out of road, and started over somewhere new. But the darkness never left me. It's always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and still, I hear it again, my name, whispered on the wind. Peter. It's only a matter of time before it finds me again. And this time, I know I won't escape. It's funny how you get used to the quiet. When you work the graveyard shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, the silence becomes your closest companion. It wraps around you like a blanket, sometimes comforting, other times suffocating. The hum of the overhead lights, the occasional hiss from the old coffee machine, and the distant chirping of crickets are all I ever hear during these long, lonely nights. My name's Tom. I'm not a man of many words. I'm in my late 40s, divorced, and I've been working this job for the better part of 3 years. It's not exactly the life I imagined, but it pays the bills, and there's something about the isolation that suits me. People come and go, faces blur into one another, and most nights it's just me and the dark stretch of highway outside. It's not a bad gig, really. You get the odd late-night traveler or trucker passing through, usually just grabbing a coffee or filling up their tank. They rarely say much, just a nod or a tired thanks before they're back on the road. I'm not complaining. The less I have to interact with people, the better. Most nights, nothing happens. And that's just how I like it. But lately, something's been off. Started with small things. The kind of things you might not even notice if you weren't paying attention. A strange customer here and there. People who didn't seem quite right. One guy came in about a week ago. Didn't look me in the eye, just stared at the floor the whole time, mumbling something under his breath. Couldn't make out what he was saying, but it gave me the creeps. Then, a few nights later, I found a bag of chips on the floor in one of the aisles. I didn't think much of it, just figured I'd knocked it over myself earlier and forgotten about it. Then, things started to escalate. Last night, around 2 in the morning, I heard something. I was sitting behind the counter, halfway through a cigarette, when I heard footsteps. Clear as day, someone walking through the aisles. My heart skipped a beat because I hadn't heard the door chime, and I was sure I was alone. I put out my smoke and stood up, peering into the dimly lit store. "Hello?" I called out, but no one answered. I walked down each aisle, checking behind the shelves, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel it. Presence of something. Someone watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty aisles and the cold, fluorescent light flickering overhead. I shook it off, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me after too many nights alone. But as I headed back to the counter, I saw it, clear as day. Written in the dust on the glass counter, a message, "I see you." My heart hammered in my chest. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of the truckers who come through regularly decided to mess with me. But the thing is, the dust had been undisturbed when I started my shift. I would have noticed something like that. I wiped the message away with a shaky hand, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had written it myself without realizing. Yeah, that had to be it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That was just the beginning. The next few nights were worse. A lot worse. It started with the cameras. We've got a set of old, grainy security cameras that cover the inside of the store and the pumps outside. I never really paid much attention to them. They were just there to give the boss peace of mind. But after what happened with the message on the counter, I found myself staring at the monitors more often, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. It was a slow night, the kind where time drags on and every minute feels like an hour. Around midnight, I glanced up at the monitors. For a second, thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. One of the cameras, the one pointed at the front of the store, flickered, just a quick static blip, nothing too unusual. These old systems glitch out all the time. But then it happened again, and this time, I saw it. Something moving, just on the edge of the frame. My heart started pounding as I leaned in closer, trying to make out what it was. Person, maybe, but it wasn't right, the way it moved. Too fast, too jerky, like it was skipping frames. I blinked, and it was gone. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to reappear, but the only thing there was the empty parking lot, bathed in the sickly yellow light of the overhead lamps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a glitch, nothing more. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, that same sense of being watched. Like eyes were boring into the back of my skull. The night wore on, each hour dragging slower than the last. I busied myself with small tasks, restocking shelves, wiping down counters, anything to keep my mind off what I'd seen. But as the clock crept closer to 3 a.m., I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the glass door at the front of the store. My head snapped up, and my heart skipped a beat. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out there, but maybe, just maybe, it was a late-night customer. I walked to the front, peering out into the darkness. Parking lot was empty. No cars, no people, just the empty pumps and the quiet highway beyond. But the knock came again, louder this time, and definitely coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the door handle. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door and turn off the lights, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was out there. I pulled the door open, and cold air rushed in, sending a chill down my spine. I stepped outside, looking around. Nothing. No one. Just the rustling of the trees in the wind and the distant hum of the highway. And then I saw it, faint, almost unnoticeable at first. A figure standing by the pumps, barely more than a shadow. My mouth went dry as I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was just standing there, completely still. It was waiting for something. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "We're closed. You need to leave." The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me, just stood there staring, though I couldn't see its eyes. I took a step closer, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when I realized I couldn't make out any features. No face, no clothes, just a dark silhouette against the dim light of the pumps. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next, just gone, like it had never been there at all. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I rushed back to the monitors, scanning each one frantically. Nothing. The lot was empty again. But the unease didn't leave me. That sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. I spent the rest of the night huddled behind the counter, eyes darting to the windows, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself again. Never did. But as I left at dawn, the first light of morning creeping over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That whatever was out there had just begun toying with me, and that it would be back. By the time I came back to work the next night, I was already on edge. Couldn't shake the images from the night before. Flickering camera, the shadowy figure, the sound of that knock echoing in my head. Sleep had been elusive, my mind trapped in a loop of what-ifs and dread. But I told myself it was just a bad night. Nothing more. I had to believe that, or I'd go crazy. The first couple of hours were uneventful, just the usual quiet routine. The kind of night I used to welcome. But now, every creak of the building settling, every flicker of the lights had me on high alert. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than not, convinced that something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Around midnight, I was restocking the cooler, the cold air biting at my skin, and I heard it again, the knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, hand clutching a bottle of soda, the cold seeping into my bones. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. But I knew better. Slowly, I stepped out of the cooler, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I made my way to the front of the store. Glass door was fogged up, but through the haze I could see a shape, tall, dark, and motionless, just like before. "Not again," I muttered under my breath, fear twisting in my gut like a knife. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This time, I didn't bother opening it. I just stared through the glass, hoping to get a better look at whatever was standing there. But as I wiped the fog away, I felt my blood run cold. The figure wasn't outside, was inside, right behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the store was empty. The aisles were deserted, only sound the faint hum of the refrigerators in the back. My eyes darted around, searching every corner, every shadow. There was nothing. Just me, standing alone in the empty store. And yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I took a shaky step back, and that's when I saw it, reflected in the glass of the door. Face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. It was there for just a split second, but it was enough to send me stumbling back in terror. Fell to the floor, heart racing, but when I looked up, the reflection, it's gone. The door was just a door again, the glass clear and empty. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it hadn't been a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games with me. That face was real. Shaking, I got to my feet, my hands gripping the counter for support. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was in this store with me. Something that wasn't human. I tried to get a grip on myself, to think rationally, but it was impossible with the memory of that face burned into my mind. I needed to get out of there, to leave before whatever it was decided to show itself again. But the thought of walking out into the dark, deserted lot made my skin crawl. I was trapped in my own fear, with no escape. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on the glass, half expecting the face to reappear. But it didn't. The store was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, amplifying every little sound until it feels like the walls are closing in. I needed to do something, anything to break the silence, keep myself from losing it completely. So I turned to the monitors again, hoping to distract myself, find some shred of normalcy in the routine of checking the cameras. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The screen flickered to life, showing the usual views of the store and the lot outside. Something was different. On every monitor, there was movement, shadows shifting and swirling just out of focus, like something was moving just beyond the edges of the camera's view. My hands trembled as I cycled through the feeds, each one more distorted than the last, the shadows growing darker, thicker, until they seemed to fill the entire screen. And then, in the middle of all that darkness, I saw them. Figures, pale and faceless, standing in the aisles, by the door, at the pumps. They were everywhere, motionless, just watching. I could feel their eyes on me, even though they had none, and it was like 1,000 needles pricking at my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen in place, my mind paralyzed with fear. The figures didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I was surrounded, trapped by something I couldn't even begin to understand. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The shadows receded, the figures vanished, and the monitors returned to normal, showing nothing but the empty store and lot. But I knew they were still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I stumbled back, heart racing, and grabbed my keys from under the counter. I couldn't stay here, not another second. I needed to get out, to escape this nightmare, before it swallowed me whole. But as I reached the door, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the lock, I felt it again. That cold, suffocating presence, like something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't need to. Because in the glass, I could see it. That face, those hollow eyes, staring back at me, closer than ever before. And this time, it smiled. I didn't remember driving home that morning. My hands were still shaking when I pulled into my driveway. Image of that smile burned into my mind. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. That twisted grin promising something I didn't want to understand. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Whatever was happening at that gas station, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. Real, in a way that defied explanation. And I needed answers. I couldn't go back there without knowing what I was dealing with. So I started digging. The gas station had been around for decades, tucked away on that lonely stretch of highway. It had changed hands a few times, but the records were sparse. The deeper I dug, the more I realized there was something no one wanted to talk about. Accidents, disappearances, things that had been written off as coincidence or bad luck. But it was too much to ignore. There was one incident that caught my eye. A story that had been buried in old newspaper clippings and forgotten police reports. 30 years ago, a man named Jack Larkin owned the station. One night, during a storm, family stopped by to fill up their tank. They never made it home. Their car was found abandoned on the side of the road a few miles away. The family, husband, wife, 2 kids, had vanished without a trace. Larkin was the last person to see them, and rumors swirled about what might have happened. Some said he was involved, that he'd done something terrible, but nothing was ever proven. A few months later, Larkin was found dead in the station, an apparent suicide. They said he'd gone mad, claimed he was seeing things, hearing voices. They found him with a shotgun in his mouth and a message scrawled on the wall in his own blood. "They're still here." That was enough to convince me I wasn't dealing with just any old haunting. The spirits, the figures I'd seen, they were tied to that night, to whatever happened to that family. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. I knew I had to go back. I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice. This thing wasn't just going to go away. It had latched onto me, and I could feel it pulling me back, like a noose tightening around my neck. I had to face it, to end it, or I'd end up like Larkin. Another victim, another ghost trapped in that place. That night, I armed myself with everything I could think of. A crucifix, flashlight, even a can of gasoline and a lighter, just in case. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I was damn sure going to be ready for it. The drive back was a blur. Dark highways stretching out before me like the mouth of some endless hungry beast. When I pulled into the lot, the station was quiet, just as I'd left it. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That oppressive weight, that suffocating presence that wrapped around me like a shroud. Took a deep breath and pushed through the door, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The store was just as I'd left it, but it felt different. The air was thick, heavy, like I was wading through water. I could feel them watching me, the spirits, the ghosts of that family, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I made my way to the counter, my hands shaking as I set the flashlight down and pulled out the crucifix. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I know what happened to you." For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerators and the distant buzz of the highway outside. But then, the lights began to flicker, shadows deepening until they swallowed the room whole. Temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in white puffs as the darkness closed in around me. And then, they appeared. The figures emerged from the shadows, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The husband, the wife, the two children, faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and rage. But there was something else there too, something darker. Figure standing just behind them, taller and more menacing, with eyes that burned like embers. Larkin. I could see the madness in his eyes, the twisted glee in his smile as he stepped forward, the shotgun still clutched in his hands. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice echoing around the room like the hiss of a snake. "You can't stop it. You can't stop that." I backed away, the crucifix held out in front of me like a shield. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The spirits of the family didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared, their eyes filled with a pain so deep it made my heart ache. But Larkin, he just laughed. A low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "They want justice," he said, his smile widening. "But they can't have it. They're trapped here with me, and now so are you." Panic surged through me as the shadows closed in, cold biting at my skin like icy fingers. I was out of time, out of options. In desperation, I grabbed the gasoline and started pouring it out across the floor, the smell of it filling the air, mixing with the stench of death that clung to the walls. Larkin's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized what I was doing. "You think you can burn it away?" he snarled, his voice rising. "You can't escape this. You'll die here, just like the rest of them." But I didn't care. I had to try. With a shaking hand, I struck the lighter, the small flame flickering to life. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the spirits, to the family that had been trapped here for so long. "I'm so sorry." And then, I dropped the lighter. The flames roared to life, spreading across the floor in an instant, engulfing the store in a blaze of light and heat. The shadows shrieked and twisted. The spirits caught in the fire's grasp, their forms distorting as they tried to escape. But Larkin, he just laughed, his voice rising above the crackle of the flames. "You can't kill what's already dead," he screamed, the eyes wild with madness as the fire consumed him, his body crumbling into ash. I turned and ran, the heat of the fire at my back as I burst through the door and into the night. The gas station was an inferno behind me, flames reaching up to the sky, lighting up the darkness. I didn't stop running until I was far down the highway, the glow of the fire fading in the distance. I collapsed on the side of the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The station was gone. The spirits, Larkin, they were gone. But I knew, deep down, that I hadn't escaped. Not really, because some things, once they've seen you, once they've touched you, they never let go. And in the stillness of the night, in the quiet moments when the world is dark and silent, I can still feel them watching me. Waiting. I've always been a night owl. There's something comforting about the dark, the way it wraps around you like a blanket, hiding all the things you don't want to see. That's probably why I took the night shift at the gas station. Out here, on the edge of town, it's just me, the empty road, and the hum of the old fluorescent lights. Quiet, peaceful, or at least it used to be. It started about 2 weeks ago. I'd just settled into my usual routine, counting the till, wiping down the counters, checking the cameras. Same old, same old. The night was as uneventful as they come, with only a couple of cars passing by every few hours. I was just about to brew a fresh pot of coffee when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, through the smeared glass of the front window, I caught a glimpse of someone standing by pump 3. It was odd, because I hadn't heard a car pull up. And believe me, out here, you hear everything. The crunch of gravel, the creak of old metal doors, the hollow sound of footsteps echoing in the dead of night. But this time, nothing. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure was tall, standing just on the edge of the station's light, where the shadows start to take over. I couldn't make out much, just a shape, really. But something felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but my gut was twisting in knots, screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the door, and forget I ever saw anything. But curiosity's a funny thing. It makes you do stupid things, like step out into the night when every instinct tells you not to. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter, the one I hadn't used in months, and pushed open the door. The cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and sudden, making my breath hang in the air like smoke. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too shaky in the silence. No answer, just the faint hum of the lights above, buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. I took a few steps forward, the gravel crunching under my boots, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But when I reached pump 3, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I turned to go back inside, I felt it. A sudden, bone-chilling cold that seeped into my skin, freezing me in place. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned back towards the pumps, my flashlight flickering as it passed over the empty space. And then I saw it. Just for a second, but clear as day. A shadowy figure, standing right behind me in the reflection of the glass. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty station and the sound of my own breathing, coming out in short, panicked bursts. I didn't sleep that morning. I just sat in the break room, the lights on full blast, waiting for the sun to rise, the world to feel normal again. But deep down, I knew things were far from normal. Something had changed. And whatever it wasn't finished with me yet. After that night, things started getting weird. At first, it was just small stuff. Things I could brush off as coincidence. The lights would flicker, but they'd always done that. The security cameras would glitch, but that's nothing new for an old system like ours. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired, imagining things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. It was a few days later when the really strange stuff started happening. I was in the middle of my shift, flipping through a magazine, trying to pass the time. It was one of those dead nights where even the road seemed to hold its breath. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, expecting to see a trucker or some late-night traveler, but the door was closed. That was the first time I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth just outside the station. I froze, my eyes darting to the security monitors. All the screens were black, glitching out like a bad TV signal. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy boots, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there. Just an empty lot, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlight. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight, the same one I'd used that first night. I didn't want to go outside, but something was pulling me towards the door, like a force I couldn't resist. I stepped out, cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. Footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I scanned the area with my flashlight, every shadow twisting into something sinister, every rustle of leaves making my heart race. And then, just on the edge of the lot, I saw it again, the figure. This time, it was clearer, more defined. It looked like a man, but there was something off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings, and his face was just a blur, a smear of darkness that my eyes couldn't quite focus on. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the cold air. No answer. The figure just stood there, staring, or at least I thought it was staring. The longer I looked, the more I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like something was squeezing the air out of my lungs. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in some sort of nightmare. And then it spoke. At first, it was just a whisper, barely audible over the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, until I could make out the words. "You didn't stop." It hissed, the voice raspy and cold, like nails on a chalkboard. "You didn't stop." The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure started to move towards me, its feet dragging across the gravel, each step echoing in the empty night. "You didn't stop." Repeated, words drilling into my skull, dredging up memories I'd tried so hard to forget. Memories of that night, all those years ago. The night I made the worst mistake of my life. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted back into the station. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I didn't move from that spot until the sun started to rise, casting pale light through the windows. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the lot was empty. No sign of the figure, no footsteps in the gravel. It was like it had never been there at all. But I knew better. It was there, and it wasn't going away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even during the day, when the sun was high and the gas station was busy, I felt those eyes on me. Cold, unforgiving. Nights, though. Nights were the worst. That's when the real terror began. A few days after the last encounter, I was back at the station. My nerves were shot, and every little sound made me jump. The creak of the old metal door, the hum of the coolers, even the distant howls of coyotes out in the desert. It all set me on edge. But it was the silence that scared me most. The way the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to keep busy, telling myself that if I just kept moving, I wouldn't have time to think. But the night was dragging on, and no amount of busy work could distract me from the creeping dread that had taken root in my gut. Around 3 a.m., the clock ticking on the wall seemed to slow, each second stretching out into an eternity. I was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot over and over, when the lights started flickering again. At first, it was just a few brief flickers, like before. Then they went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold on to it. The beam cut through the darkness, but it only made things worse, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught between fear and something else, something deeper, darker. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered back on, harsh and blinding. Blinked, disoriented, trying to get my bearings. And that's when I saw it, standing just inside the door, bathed in the sickly fluorescent light. Figure was back. It was closer this time, close enough that I could make out the details I'd missed before. Face, or what should have been a face, was a twisted mass of darkness, like a smudge on a mirror. Body, though, was horribly familiar. A man's frame, dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothes. My breath caught in my throat as recognition slammed into me like a freight train. It was him, the man I'd killed. I stumbled back, crashing into the shelves behind me, knocking over cans and bottles in my panic. Figure didn't move, just stood there watching me with that hollow, faceless stare. My mind was racing, flooded with memories I'd buried deep. Memories of that night, of the sickening thud as the car hit him, of the way his body crumpled like a rag doll on the asphalt. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I'm so sorry." The figure took a step forward, and the lights flickered again, dimming to a low, pulsing glow. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and I gagged, my stomach churning. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare. My legs refused to cooperate. All I could do was stand there, trembling, as the figure came closer. "You didn't stop," rasped, the voice like sandpaper against my skin. "You left me there." The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something that nearly drove me mad. His face, it was there, clear as day, twisted in a mask of pain and anger. His eyes, oh God, his eyes, burned with a hatred so intense it seared itself into my brain. When the lights came back on, the figure was right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the icy cold radiating off him. He reached out a hand, skeletal and covered in blood, and I couldn't move, couldn't even scream as those cold, dead fingers brushed against my arm. The touch was like a jolt of electricity, snapping me out of my stupor. I bolted, racing through the back door, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran blindly into the night. The darkness swallowed me whole, cold air tearing at my lungs, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I could still hear his voice, echoing in my mind, chasing me through the night. "You didn't stop." I don't know how long I ran, or where I ended up. When I finally collapsed, exhausted and broken, I was miles away from the station, deep in the desert, surrounded by nothing but darkness. I lay there, gasping for breath, the stars spinning above me in the vast, uncaring sky. Thought I was safe. But as I lay there, I felt it again. Cold, creeping dread. I turned my head, and there he was, standing at the edge of the shadows, watching me with those burning eyes. And then I knew. I could run as far as I wanted. There was no escaping him. No matter where I went, he would follow, because some things you can't outrun. I didn't go back to the gas station. I couldn't. Every time I thought about stepping foot in that place again, I felt that icy hand on my arm, heard that voice in my head. But avoiding it didn't help. The nightmares followed me home. The shadows that shouldn't be there, the whispers that twisted through the dark, and always, always the echo of that voice. "You didn't stop." I tried everything to drown it out. TV blaring, radio turned up full blast. Nothing could silence him. He was there in every reflection, every fleeting shadow, watching, waiting. I barely slept, barely ate. I was falling apart, and I knew it. The guilt was eating me alive. I'd killed a man. I'd left him there, to die on that lonely road all those years ago, and now his ghost had come to collect what was owed. There was no escaping it. The only way to stop this was to face it head on, to confront the thing that had been haunting me for so long. I don't know what I expected to find when I went back to the station that night. Maybe I thought it would be empty, that it was all in my head, just some twisted nightmare I could shake off. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The place was different. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse like they were alive. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. He was waiting for me. The figure stood in the middle of the station, bathed in the sickly glow of the flickering lights. He was clearer now, more real. His face was a mask of rage and pain, twisted beyond recognition. But those eyes, those burning eyes, were the same. They locked onto me the moment I walked in, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "You didn't stop," he whispered, his voice filling the room, echoing off the walls. "You left me to die." "I'm sorry," I croaked, my throat dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm so sorry." But the words felt hollow, empty. They couldn't undo what I'd done. They couldn't bring him back. He moved closer, his steps slow, deliberate, like he was savoring my fear. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was right there, just a few steps away, but it might as well have been a mile. My legs wouldn't move, my body frozen in place, locked in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "You can't run from this," he hissed, his breath cold against my skin. "You can't hide." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block him out, trying to will him away. But when I opened them, he was right in front of me, his face inches from mine. I could see every detail now. The bloodstains on his clothes, twisted, broken bones, the raw, ragged flesh. But it was his eyes that held me, those burning eyes that seemed to see right through me, into the darkest corners of my soul. "You didn't stop," he repeated, his voice low and menacing. "Now you'll never stop." The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt his cold hands close around my throat. I gasped, clawing at his hands, but there was nothing to grab onto. It was like trying to fight smoke. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the air was squeezed from my lungs. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he let go. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The room was spinning, the walls closing in around me. And I knew this was it. There was no escape, no running from what I'd done. I sank to the floor, the cold tile pressing against my skin, the world spinning out of control. And still, he stood there, watching me with those burning eyes, his presence filling the room, pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You didn't stop," he whispered one last time, his voice echoing in my head, driving me to the brink of madness. "And now, neither will I." The lights flickered one final time, and everything went black. When I woke up, the station was empty. The lights were on, steady and bright, and the air was clear. But I knew he was still there, waiting, watching. I could feel his eyes on me, could hear his voice in the back of my mind, a constant, nagging reminder of what I'd done. I didn't stop, and now, neither would he. It was another one of those nights, the kind that makes you question why you ever took a job like that. I've been working the graveyard shift at this rundown gas station for almost 6 months now, and every time the sun sets and the shadows stretch across the cracked pavement, I start to regret it. The station is in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods that seem to swallow the light. The nearest town is over 20 miles away, and the road is practically deserted at this hour. It's just me, the hum of the neon sign outside, and the constant buzz of the old refrigerator behind the counter. Tonight felt different, though. I could feel it the moment I clocked in. The air was thick, heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. It was the kind of night where every little sound seemed magnified, every creak and groan of the building making my heart race just a bit faster. It started with the lights. They've always been a little flickery, but tonight they seemed to have a mind of their own. One minute they'd be blazing bright, the next they'd dim down to almost nothing, leaving me in a pool of darkness. And that was when I first noticed it. Feeling of being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, just out of sight. But there was nothing. Just the silent trees swaying in the breeze, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the lot. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I'd been through enough night shifts to know how your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in a place like this. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I tried to focus on my work, counting out the till, restocking the shelves, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every time I glanced up, I swore I saw something. Quick movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past the windows. And then, the footsteps. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of gravel, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I froze, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside the door. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the door didn't open. The bell didn't ring. There was nothing but silence. Slowly, I let out the breath I'd been holding, my pulse gradually slowing down. I was just about to convince myself it was all in my head when the lights outside flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the emergency bulbs inside the station. I reached for the flashlight I kept under the counter, my hands shaking. Just as my fingers closed around it, I heard it again. Footsteps, right outside the door. Louder this time, more deliberate. And then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I stood there, flashlight in hand, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. The silence pressed in on me, so thick I could almost feel it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the footsteps, the flickering lights, the gnawing sense of dread that clung to the air like a bad smell. And then, just as I was about to take a step toward the door, I saw it. The headlight. They appeared out of nowhere, cutting through the darkness like a knife, blindingly bright in the pitch-black night. A car was pulling into the lot, its tires crunching over the gravel as it rolled to a stop by the pumps. Relief flooded through me at the thought of another person being here, but it was short-lived. Something wasn't right. The car just sat there, idling, its engine rumbling softly in the quiet night. I couldn't see the driver, the windows tinted too dark to make out any details. A shiver ran down my spine as I watched, waiting for the driver to step out to do something, but they just stayed put, as if they were waiting for me. Finally, the driver's door creaked open. A man got out, moving with a stiff, almost robotic motion. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He didn't look at me as he walked around to the pump, his movements slow and deliberate. I felt my heart rate pick up, the unease growing stronger with every second. Something about the way he moved set me on edge, like he wasn't entirely human. But I pushed the thought aside, forcing myself to stay calm. People can be weird, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. Maybe he was just tired, or drunk, or both. I tried to rationalize it as I watched him fill up his tank, my eyes darting nervously between him and the car. That's when I saw it. Back seat. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now that I was looking, I could see something, or someone, sitting in the darkness. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was too dark, the figure too still. A sense of foreboding crept over me. The way the man avoided looking at the back seat, the way he moved with that unsettling stiffness, it was all wrong. The man finished pumping gas and walked toward the store. My heart pounded in my chest as he pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word as he approached the counter. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark circles under his eyes. He placed a crumpled bill on the counter, avoiding eye contact the entire time. As I rang up the sale, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced past the man toward the car. The figure in the back seat hadn't moved, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me from the shadows. My hands shook as I handed the man his change, my skin crawling with a deep, instinctual fear. The man took the change without a word, stuffing it into his pocket as he turned and walked out. I watched him go, my eyes glued to the back seat, waiting for any sign of movement. Just as he opened the car door, the figure in the back seat shifted. It was slight, just a small movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The man slid into the driver's seat, the car door shutting with a dull thud. The engine revved and the car started to pull away. As it did, I caught a glimpse of the rearview mirror, just for a second, but it was enough. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, staring directly at me through the mirror. Its expression was devoid of any emotion, just an empty, soulless gaze that seemed to reach out and grip my heart with icy fingers. I gasped, stumbling back as the car disappeared into the night, its taillights fading into the darkness. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just seen? My rational mind struggled to find an explanation, but deep down, I knew. That face, those eyes, there was something wrong. Something deeply, terrifyingly wrong. The night felt darker, the silence more oppressive. And as I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that car, it wasn't done with me yet. The car was gone, but that sense of dread, it clung to me like a second skin. I tried to shake it off. Tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But those eyes, that lifeless face, they were burned into my mind, haunting me every time I blinked. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the back seat, the way it seemed to watch me, waiting. I tried to go back to my routine, focus on anything else, but every noise made me jump. Every flicker of light had me glancing nervously toward the door. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I kept telling myself it was over, that the car wasn't coming back. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. And then, just as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., I heard it. The distant rumble of an engine. My heart sank as I looked out the window, and sure enough, there it was. The same car, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a pair of glowing eyes. This time, it wasn't just pulling into the lot. The car was swerving, moving erratically as if the driver was struggling to keep control. It skidded to a stop in front of the pumps, tires screeching against the gravel. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the fear rising like bile. The door swung open, and the man from before stumbled out. But he wasn't the same. His clothes were disheveled, his face even paler than before, if that was possible. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the car, like he was fighting to stay upright. Then I saw it. Passenger. Back door creaked open, and the figure from before stepped out. But now, in the harsh light of the station, I could see it clearly. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was a sickly, ashen color, stretched taut over sharp, bony features. Its eyes were sunken, black voids that seemed to suck the light out of the air. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on strings. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But I was rooted, the spot, frozen in terror. The man tried to back away, but it was no use. The creature's gaze locked onto him, and he let out a strangled cry as it reached out with a skeletal hand. I watched in horror as the creature's fingers wrapped around the man's throat, lifting him off the ground with an impossible strength. His body convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the life seemed to drain out of him. His skin turned gray, his eyes rolling back in his head, and within seconds he was nothing more than a lifeless husk, crumpling to the ground like an empty sack. The creature turned its head toward me, and I swear, I felt its gaze pierce right through me. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so hard, felt like it might burst out of my chest. It started to move toward me, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it got closer, that cold, hollow gaze locked on mine. Just when I thought it was all over, the creature stopped. It tilted its head, almost as if it was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, without warning, turned away, gliding back to the car. I stood there, gasping for breath as it climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. The car sped off into the night, disappearing down the road as quickly as it had come. Collapsed against the counter, my legs giving out from under me. For a long time, I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. I could still feel the icy grip of its gaze, still see the man's lifeless body crumpling to the ground. But when I finally managed to drag myself outside, there was no sign of him. No body, no car, just the faint smell of decay lingering in the air. I never saw that car again, but the memory of that night haunts me still. I left that job the next day, and I've never worked a night shift since. But no matter where I go, no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That one day, that car will return. This time, there won't be anyone else. Just me and the passenger. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. Decant.